Shouted cover-up. This is Jack Clemens, a 15-year veteran of the Los Angeles Police Department, now retired. He was the first cop on the scene at the death house. Inexplicably, Clemens was called to the house 4.5 hours after Marilyn Monroe was reportedly found dead.
Marilyn was stretched out, face down, in a soldier's position, catty-corner of the bed. Obviously, she'd been placed in that position. And I was shown the nightstand by her table, by her bed, and it was about 8 or 10 empty bottles that had contained medicine, all of barbiturates. Dr. Greenson said she must have swallowed them all. I looked in the bathroom for a half-empty glass or a glass that had been used. There was none. I asked for, had anybody seen a document, any written statements, and no one had seen any written statements. There was no suicide note, and the only thing we had there at that time was some empty bottles.
And when you got to the house, who let you in?
Mrs. Murray, the housekeeper. She became very concerned and called Dr. Greenson, who lived just a few minutes away.
And what, if anything, did you ask Dr. Greenson?
I asked, since this all occurred shortly after midnight, and the call came to me at 4:25 a.m., I asked why it took 4 hours to call the police.
What was the response, if any, from Dr. Greenson?
Well, Dr. Greenson finally spoke up, and he said they had to get permission from the publicity department of the studio before they could notify anybody.
Do you have any theory as to what happened in this instance?
Yes, I do.
And what is that?
Marilyn Monroe was murdered.
When a second officer arrived on the scene, Dr. Ralph Greenson told him Marilyn Monroe's body was discovered at 3 a.m. It was shortly after 3 in the morning on August 5, 1962, here at Schaefer's ambulance, that a young ambulance driver by the name of James Hall says that he got a call to Marilyn's house. Now, if what he says is true, and I emphasize the word if, then another thunderbolt of mystery has been thrown into the Marilyn tragedy. Because James Hall says that when he arrived at Marilyn's house, Marilyn Monroe was still alive.
We did what we could to save her. And I believe we could have saved her if we'd had the opportunity to take her to the hospital.
There was a conflict, there is a conflict, and there are at least two different versions of the conflict.
Marilyn was a girl that knew too much.
I've heard of affairs that are strictly platonic, but diamonds are a girl's best friend. And I think affairs that you must give Masonic are better bets. If little pets get big baguettes.
Officially, Marilyn Monroe died on August 5th, 1962. Officially, the cause of death, probable suicide. Case closed. But unofficially, there's so much conflicting information that twice the LA County District Attorney's Office considered impaneling a grand jury. It did not. What you are hearing tonight is much of the testimony and evidence that is clearly available to a grand jury.
12305, Elena. Schaefer's Unit 88, respond to unconscious person. 12305, Elena.
In the early morning hours of August 5th, 1962, the Schaefer Ambulance Service radioed one of its ambulances to go to Marilyn Monroe's home. Driver James Hall claims he answered that call and arrived at her house at 3:30 a.m.
Marilyn was in the bedroom laying on the bed. At that point, in trying to determine what was wrong with the patient, we ascertained that her breathing was very shallow. Her pulse was very weak and rapid, and she was unconscious at that time. We did what we could to save her, and I believe we could have saved her if we'd had the opportunity to take her to the hospital. But the doctor arrived before we could go.
What happened?
A man entered her house and stated that he was her doctor, and at that point, if there's a doctor, the doctor becomes in charge.
And what was his name?
Ralph Greenson.
Greenson. What did he do? Tell me.
Oh, he started to give her the CPR, and he administered an injection, which I assumed to be adrenaline because I've seen the procedures before.
You assumed it was adrenaline, and you saw the injection. Which part of the body did he inject this adrenaline into?
Injected it into her heart.
And when he removed that syringe, right?
Yeah.
What happened then?
Then we continued with the CPR for about another 3 to 5 minutes. And then he put his stethoscope on her and he said, I'm going to pronounce her dead, you can leave.
Was she dead?
She was dead then, yes.
Were you surprised?
No, but I was sick.
What do you mean you were sick?
Well, you know, we had her saved. She was saved. If that guy hadn't walked in, I'd have had her to the hospital. She'd be alive today.
You sure about that?
Absolutely.
And there are other stories about the night she died. In 1982, Los Angeles Deputy District Attorney Mike Carroll headed up an investigation to sort through the conflicting information and to determine whether the case should be presented to a grand jury. It never was, even though Carroll himself readily admits that the official version of events that night is seriously flawed.
There's no question there's a conflict there, and there's a conflict of possibly 3.5 hours. There's the one story that the housekeeper found her around midnight. The official report done near the time of death said that it was like closer to 3:30 in the morning. I can't explain it away. What I can tell you is there was a conflict, there is a conflict, and there are at least 2 different versions of the conflict.
In fact, there are many more. Take Walt Schaefer, who headed up the Schaefer ambulance service that responded to the call. He is now dead, but in a 1985 interview, he said, an ambulance did go to the scene that night, but it was not driven by James Hall.
We took Marilyn Monroe in on an overdose. And, of course, she succumbed at the hospital. She was alive when she was picked up, yes.
Hospital and ambulance records that could substantiate the stories of Walt Schaefer and James Hall no longer exist. And then there's the story of this man, Abe Landau. He was Marilyn's next-door neighbor. Tonight, he breaks a 26-year-long silence to tell of a mysterious midnight traffic jam in front of Marilyn's house the night she died. When he asked what was going on, no one would say.
We had been out to a party, and we came home, and the place was like Grand Central Station. The cars were all the way up the alley, and the limousines of, I don't know who was it, but some limousine was here, I don't know who it was, and of course police cars and the ambulance.
After you went inside your house, what happened?
Someone knocked on the door, wanted to know what we knew about Marilyn Monroe, and we told him nothing.
Did the visitor describe himself as a reporter? Did he identify himself as a police officer?
He didn't identify himself at all.
And there is more. Natalie Jacobs, widow of Hollywood mogul Arthur Jacobs, paints a picture of how Marilyn's crisis may have started as early as 12 hours before her body was removed from her home. That night, the Jacobs were attending a concert at the Hollywood Bowl. It was Mrs. Jacobs' birthday.
Now, at one stage, your husband got a call from someone.
Yes, I don't know whomsoever exactly it was, but someone came to our box and said, Arthur. They didn't even say Mr. Jacobs. They said, Arthur, now. And he said, don't tell me. And it was Marilyn. She was already dead.
About what time of night was that?
9:30, 10. It was in the middle of the concert.
Did you see your husband after that?
Not for 3 days. He was the whole time at Miss Monroe's house.
So there are as many versions of how she died as there are witnesses. Time of death ranges from 10 p.m. to 3:30 a.m., a span of more than 5 hours. Enough time to cover up evidence of foul play. Enough of a discrepancy to demand the scrutiny of any grand jury investigating the death of Marilyn Monroe.
Crowds of the curious are held back at a respectful distance from the private funeral that Joe DiMaggio and others arranged for Marilyn Monroe.
At first, the death of Marilyn Monroe was a logical, if tragic, consequence of a fragile human who finally walked to the edge of despair where there was no return. It was suicide. But then the web of conflicting stories. Her friends hoped for cold, hard facts, yet even the rigor of medical science failed them. The autopsy raised almost as many questions as it tried to answer. One-time medical examiner from Suffolk